I know this is the kind of thing that is liable to get me kicked out of polite society, but Donald Trump quite often says stuff that's right. And his recent comments on wind power are no exception. Besides that, he's hilarious, and the more the better. But before we come on to why he's right, this channel needs viewers. It needs subscribers. Please, we're begging. Hit the subscribe button, and we'd love to have you on board. But on with the show. Donald Trump has appeared speaking to Nigel Farage on GB News, which is a bit of a coup for both Farage and GB News. They were talking about wind power, and Donald Trump said that Boris Johnson was making a big mistake by backing wind power. He says the energy source is only backed by environmentalists who hate the world, which is true. It's just true. As the Telegraph here reports, he says that Boris Johnson is making a big mistake by trying to turn the UK into the Saudi Arabia of wind, Donald Trump has said. Boris has previously claimed this, and it is nonsense, as Mark, oh dear, Yorkshire Post, go away, as Mark Littlewood of the Institute of Economic Affairs said, as reported in Yorkshire News, to compare wind power in the country to Saudi Arabia's oil wealth is a fantasy. The value of the UK wind industry is about £7.5 billion a year, and the Saudi petroleum industry is roughly £223 billion a year. So it's a nonsense from the off. But back to Mr. Trump. The former US president, Telegraph continues, said that wind farms were horrible, ridiculous, kill all the birds, and start to rust after a couple of years. And they were only backed by environmentalists who hate the world, he said. All of this is true. Wind is a fan. It is. I can't believe I'm going to say this because it's a horrible pun. It's a load of hot air. I apologise, but he's right. He's objectively right. Wind farms are bad. They are terrible. They don't do the job that they've been designed to do. They're incredibly damaging. Their environmental cost is in fact incredibly high because you do have to replace the blades because they do break down, they do corrode, and disposal of these blades, like disposal of solar panels, is very poorly managed and usually involves poisoning the wells of small African villages to which we export them. And yeah, they kill all the birds. They're terrible for the environment. So Trump is completely right about this. He has his own personal reasons for saying it, of course. He took aim, the Telegraph reports, at a wind farm sited just off the coast of Aberdeen, where he owns the Trump International Golf Links, describing it as a shame and the windmills as monsters in an interview with Nigel Farage on GB News. Mr. Johnson, the Prime Minister, has made his increasing reliance on wind energy a cornerstone of his energy policy. They should just, at this point, put a wind turbine in front of his mouth. Telling the United Nations that last year he wanted to make the UK into the Saudi Arabia of wind, mimicking Riyadh's dominance in the global oil market. Well, oil is important and valuable because it's useful. Wind is not. So, good luck. And we're having to spend money on this. They're making money on theirs. Mr. Trump said Mr. Johnson was wrong, adding he's making a big mistake. He says he's gone more on the liberal side, which for people who use words correctly, i.e. not Americans, he means he's gone to the left, which is again true. He said he liked Mr. Johnson and had always gotten along with him, but added he's gone a little bit more on the liberal side. He added, I'm surprised that he would allow that to happen because you have one of the most beautiful countries in the world and you're destroying it with all these wind turbines all over the place. Mr. Trump lost a lengthy court battle in 2019 against the siting of a wind farm in Aberdeen Bay near one of his golf courses. He told Mr. Farage, wind power is ridiculous, a horrible thing for Scotland. I get to see it because I own great properties in Scotland and Ireland. I would do the impression if I could. Because I own great properties in Scotland and Ireland and I look at these magnificent fields with their horrible windmills all over them. The windmills do not age well, Mr. Trump claimed. Once they're there for a couple of years, they start to rust and wear out and look terrible, look even worse. Yeah, did environmentalists liking this stuff? I think they hate the world. Again, true. All of that is true. I actually have other reasons to not like wind beside the aesthetics. I actually don't think wind turbines look as terrible as a lot of their opponents think they do. My reason for opposing them vociferously is that they are incredibly expensive and don't work. I think that's a stronger argument to make. Aesthetics is, I studied aesthetics. I did dissertations in aesthetics. I like aesthetics. It's a very useful subject. But there are more pressing matters, I think, for the British public, like energy prices, the American public too, energy prices, for instance. Mr. Trump could look, of course, closer to home to find examples of how this isn't working, as we have here in an article in The Hill, which is effectively explaining that the Biden administration's energy policies have not only ended American energy independence, which was achieved under the Trump administration, but are leading to skyrocketing prices for energy, which are hitting Americans in the pocket and hitting them very, very hard. As Hill reports here, according to U.S. Energy Information Administration, heating costs for American families will rise by 54% this winter, making it the most expensive in over a decade. Given President Biden's statements on the 2020 campaign trail, where he launched a war on domestic energy production, this was entirely predictable. The Biden campaign made a clear and unequivocal campaign promise to end fossil fuel leasing on public lands, Sierra Club Executive Director Michael Brune told the Washington Post shortly after Election Day. Just hours after his inauguration, the Hill continues, President Biden walked into the Oval Office and issued an executive order stopping construction on the Keystone XL pipeline, and 1 week later he followed through on promises made to halt new oil and gas leasing on federal land. The White House justified the moves as crucial to combating climate change. But none of this was true. Much was made of the Trump administration pulling the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement, for instance. And nothing was made of the fact that despite not being in the Paris Climate Agreement, the United States continued reducing its emissions. Because it doesn't fit the narrative. To stop climate change, which we must do, the only possible response is a state response. It's a government response. In the context of the United States, it's a federal response. We can't possibly leave it up to science, innovation, technology, and states' rights to do this, even though they just objectively did. Because again, despite not being in the Paris Climate Agreement, the United States reduced its emissions, largely by relying on fracking, which the Biden administration has increasingly taken steps to outlaw, because fracking is much cleaner than other forms of energy production, much, much cleaner than coal, much cleaner than oil, cleaner than other forms of gas production, which is how the United States, paradoxically, in the minds of idiot environmentalists who know nothing about environmentalism, is how the United States paradoxically increased fracking and reduced its emissions. There is in fact no paradox here to anybody who takes more than 5 minutes to read the science behind this. But the administration, the Hill continues, is considering the shutdown of the L5 pipeline as well that runs from Canada to Michigan, which would further limit energy transport and supply, both things which are known to drive up prices. It's not about a cost, it's about an investment, Kamala Harris said about the push in 2019, but Americans, the Hill notes, are now paying the price. I must tell you I don't have a near-term answer, Biden said during a recent CNN town hall when asked about energy becoming more expensive. It's going to be hard. There is an immediate answer. Reverse everything you've done and reinstitute more of Donald Trump's policies. That will work. It's really simple. It's not complicated. That is hilarious. Would that I had the magic wand on this, Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm told CNBC, laughing out loud when asked what her plans were to increase oil production in the United States. They did attempt to do some face-saving. The United States has an oil reserve built up, I think, after the 78 oil crisis, the OPEC oil crisis of the 70s under the Carter administration, to try and limit the effects of subsequent oil crises or oil embargoes. And Biden made a big splash of releasing, I don't remember how many tens of millions of barrels, which transpired to be 3 days' worth. They didn't mention that bit because it doesn't sound impressive, but they did mention it was tens of millions because, that sounds good. Of course, it did nothing, and energy prices continue to rise. But again, if you back Donald Trump's policies, that is a magic wand. Because one of the really good ways of avoiding, for instance, having to release oil reserves, or making yourself less vulnerable to oil market crashes, for instance, in the broader economy, the global economy, is to make yourself energy independent, which the Trump administration did. Magic wand. In December, and under President Trump's leadership, the Hill continues, the United States became a net exporter of energy for the first time in 75 years. The shift to net exports is the dramatic result of an unprecedented boom in American oil production, with thousands of wells pumping from the Permian region of Texas and New Mexico to the Bakken in North Dakota to the Marcellus in Pennsylvania, Fortune reported at the time. A shale revolution has transformed oil wildcatters into billionaires and the US into the world's largest petroleum producer, surpassing Russia and Saudi Arabia. The power of OPEC has been diminished, undercutting one of the major geopolitical forces of the last half-century, which is good. Again, it's another lefty paradox, which is that they think that we're too slavish in our attitude toward the Saudi Arabians. Well, we didn't need to be once America became energy independent. If you undercut OPEC, of which Saudi Arabia is a staple part, then you don't need to be nice to the Saudi Arabians. It's unnecessary. You're not relying on them for your energy anymore. You're exporting energy, in fact. It's geopolitically, objectively useful. It means the Americans have much less of an interest in the Middle East, therefore get involved in fewer city wars, for instance. Both things that the left used to like. Paradoxically, again, its environmental policies will create more American involvement in the Middle East because it makes the Middle East more important, because it means we have to rely on oil from the Middle East in order to power our homes, to heat our homes, and all the rest of it. So another terrific achievement there by the Biden administration. Biden's failure to take on the challenge to lower energy costs is part of a broader strategy to force Americans into alternative United Nations-approved and Green New Deal-backed energy sources like wind and solar, the Hill's article continues. The left wants everyday Americans John Kerry and Barack Obama not included, to use fewer fossil fuels. When prices are high, oil and gas become unaffordable and therefore people use less of it. The Green New Deal, endorsed by Democrats and the Biden administration, calls for the elimination of fossil fuels by 2030. One way to get there is to make it too expensive for Americans to buy or consume. The energy policies implemented by President Biden during his first year in office indicate the country is being put on that path. Politically, and with plummeting poll numbers, the White House has been grasping for someone to blame, prompting Biden to berate OPEC for rising costs. Higher gasoline costs, if left unchecked, risk harming the ongoing global recovery. The price of crude oil has been higher than it was at the end of 2019, before the onset of the pandemic, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said in August. Although we are not a party to OPEC, the United States will always speak to international partners regarding issues of significance that affect our national economic and security affairs, in public and in private. Okay, or you could just do what Trump did and export oil rather than import it. That's a really good way of not relying on OPEC to set oil prices for you by releasing or not releasing more oil. And you have to give them bribes to do this. But no, rather than do that, campaigns against fossil fuels make Americans pay more for it. Of course, Americans still have to actually, heat their homes and drive their cars and live. And that's an inconvenience for the environmentalists who think that humans are an inconvenience. The Hills article continues that the pleas for OPEC to pump more oil overseas have been embarrassing and ineffective. While single Chinese companies pollute more than entire countries, Americans are being told to throw on an extra sweater if it gets chilly this winter. The best Biden administration officials can do, and the president himself, is to throw up their hands and essentially say, deal with it. Yeah, that is effectively the line. So again, Trump is right. And Americans wouldn't be putting up with this if they had kept Donald Trump in office, and they won't have to put up with it if they elect him back into office. I have my own reasons not to like him very much. I think there are other better people who could do a better job in his position. But actually not very many. And if it's a choice between Donald Trump and the Democrats, if it's a choice between America becoming energy independent again, or America going to war against fossil fuels and driving people into poverty in the name of some messianic cult of environmentalism, I know which one I'd vote for, no matter what other baggage Donald Trump comes with. There is more US context. The US Department of Energy reported that the US has now imported 6.1 million barrels of crude oil from Russia, reported in March this year from Real Clear Energy, which is the highest level in nearly 10 years. March also marked a milestone for Russia, which became America's third largest oil exporter. To make matters worse, June crude imports from Russia were reported at a staggering 7.5 million barrels, or nearly 30% higher than they were even in the highest month under President Trump, which is even more environmentally unfriendly, because not only are you using the oil in the first place, but you're having to get it shipped over from Russia, or you're having to get it shipped over from the Middle East, which is just worse for the environment all around. And then, of course, we've already mentioned that the Biden administration's campaigns against fracking, and fracking is a really clean form of energy compared to most other commonly available forms of energy, and it's available in abundance in the United States, and it's much less carbon intensive. It's good for the environment, but no, lefties don't like it, therefore it can't happen. Back to the UK, Christopher Snowdon, I think I've mentioned this piece before, has a good piece in The Critic. I think this was a couple of months ago, September 2021. Sort of puts into context the requirements of Boris Johnson's own energy policy, because we've just gone through some of the disastrous consequences of the Biden policy. But the United Kingdom has its own ambitious targets, as Christopher Snowdon writes in The Critic. Britain is a world leader in setting targets for greenhouse gas emissions. They are legion, they are ambitious, they are rigorous, they are in some barely comprehensible way legally binding. Thanks to Theresa May for that. So we've got net zero commitments and all the rest. Boris Johnson has promised to cut carbon emissions by 68% compared to 1990 levels by 2030, which outflanks the feeble 57% target set by girly swat David Cameron. And then Johnson has subsequently boasted the most ambitious target to cut emissions in the world of 78% by 2035. And it could just go higher. We've had COP26 where other commitments have been made, and the United Kingdom had an incentive to go overboard with its city climate commitments because it was hosting it. But the effects are very similar to that in the US. We're not quite as far along yet, but it's going to get there. And it's also impracticable. So as Christopher Snowdon points out in The Critic, by 2050, when the United Nations hopes to achieve net zero, there'll be 10 billion people in the world, which is twice as many as in 1990. It's 3-ish billion more than we currently have. China expects its carbon dioxide emissions to peak in 2030. So how do you get to net zero at a time when the single largest emitter in the world is only reaching its peak in the year when we attempt to reach net zero? Does that add up? No, of course it doesn't, because it's the United Nations. That alone makes a mockery of the UN's target, Christopher Snowden writes. India has refused to sign up for anything more ambitious than a 35% reduction by 2030. Brazil's President Bolsonaro, under pressure from the USA, has pledged to go carbon neutral by 2050, but no one believes him. Turkey and Iran haven't even ratified the Paris Climate Agreement, and they're both fairly substantial emitters, and in the Iranian case, I think a fairly large producer of oil as well. So that's sort of not good. Emissions, Christopher Snowden continues, are now 44% below 1990 levels, which apparently has been enough to convince conservative politicians they can push it down to 68% by the end of the decade. But, he says, there is only so much heavy industry you can outsource to the developing world before you have to make tough decisions, because that is, in fact, this is the one area on which I agree with Greta Thunberg when she says that the UK claiming to be the world's leading carbon emissions reducer is just statistical trickery. It is. It's been achieved because we outsource the production of the things we consume, and we don't count production of our consumer goods overseas as part of our emissions. So if you move all your factories overseas, then yeah, your national emissions are lower. But your demand for the goods produced by those factories hasn't changed and has in fact increased. So net emissions globally have gone up as a result of your actions. But we still claim to be world leading on this. It's self-evidently dishonest. But it's the kind of thing that the Green Lobby encourages. Because the Green Lobby is just one big PR exercise. It's hugely the whole benefit of it is reputational. That's why so much money is put into the PR side of green campaigning. It's incredibly lucrative for dishonest people. That's the green movement summed up. Christopher Snowden continues that decarbonising transport is the fairly easy bit. People quite like electric cars. They cut pollution, their range is improved, they're cheap to run. But, he says, it will take a mammoth infrastructure project to install charging points for the millions of drivers who park their car on the street, which is 60% of them in high-density areas. There was, of course, the fascinating and hilarious instance in COP26 itself, where they tried to get, was it Teslas, I think, to channel to drive all the delegates around. But it turned out there was only one charging station in the region, and so there were just hundreds of thousands of Teslas lined up waiting to be charged. There were pictures of green buses which broke down. There was a great one where a green bus broke down and was being hauled off by a very, very carbon intensive truck because it ran out of battery. It gives very visual demonstration of the idiocy and the nonsense involved in green ambitions, because it's just not practicable. Christopher Snowden continues, furthermore, decarbonising transport will require us to produce 2 or 3 times as much electricity as we do today, and yet renewables do not come close to meeting our existing needs. In the past year, less than a quarter of the UK's energy came from renewables, sources mostly from highly unreliable wind. 42% came from fossil fuels, mostly gas, and 17% came from nuclear. Nuclear power plants are being closed down, he says, and only one is being constructed, and with shale gas off the table, because this country is even more insane as regards fracking than the United States is. Where is the green energy going to come from to power our vehicles, he asks. After that, things get more difficult. The government says decarbonising the UK will cost £1 trillion, but then it also said HS2 would cost £36 billion, so since HS2's budget is now 3 times higher, the Global Warming Policy Foundation's estimate of net zero costing more than £3 trillion may be more realistic, he says. And this in addition to our contribution to $100 billion of climate finance the rich world has promised to give developing countries every year. He says it will not be long before 25 million households are told to rip out gas boilers and pay £20,000 for a less efficient electric heat pump and insulation. Those heat pumps, incidentally, are much less efficient when it's cold, which is exactly when you need them. So they end up costing a huge amount of money, which people can't afford, and the government is not giving subsidies to the vast majority of people. It announced a very small subsidy, the equivalent of something like is tens of thousands of homes, as opposed to the tens of millions it has to cover. It's not going to work. They're very inefficient in cold weather, meaning they're more expensive to run, they're incredibly expensive to install, and they end up meaning that you're forcing people into more and cheaper forms of heat production, which are more environmentally damaging, like coal. So again, policy intent and policy incentive do not match, and for some reason we always look at intent. Politics is run on intent. Nobody pays attention to incentive, which is what really drives the results of political ambitions and actions. And again, the climate movement is this par excellence. Christopher Snowden continues that months of violent protests by the Gilets Jaunes were caused by government putting a 6p on a litre of diesel. Macron froze the carbon tax, froze gas and electricity prices, postponed tougher vehicle emission rules. But in Britain, the fuel tax protests of September were the only time Labour lost its lead over the Conservatives, and that was when Labour were incredibly popular as well. And Gordon Brown did much the same thing. He cut and froze petrol duty. So politicians have been reluctant to do this again, but they are unfortunately going to have to be done again, because these are the obvious results, they are the necessary results of the government's climate policies, which will make it incredibly unpopular, which again means that ambition and action is unlikely to match. But we can extrapolate beyond the United States and the United Kingdom. There is a broader problem with renewables. This is Michael Schellenberger, who I'll never tire of recommending because he's excellent, writing in Forbes that renewables are around the world in crisis because they're making electricity more expensive, subsidies are expiring, and projects are being blocked by wildlife conservationists and local communities. So in Germany, for instance, he writes, the world leader in renewables, just 35 wind turbines were installed this year. That's 2020, I believe, for anybody interested in the date. The country needs to install 1,400 per year to meet its climate change targets. And even De Wilt we'll go on to De Welt, actually, because even the German media is starting to notice that German energy policy has completely failed. Schellenberger continues that the halting of wind deployment in Germany has resulted in the industry shedding 25,000 jobs over the last year. So remember that when Biden tells you that it's not about cost, it's about job creation. Yeah, no, it's not. It's going to cost people's jobs. And it's also going to cost them a lot more money. Schellenberger continues that it's not clear if Germany can handle much more wind. Its electricity grid operator increasingly has to cut off electricity from industrial wind farms on windy, low-demand days to avoid blowouts, and the same is happening in California. The grid operator increasingly must pay neighbouring states to take the state's excess solar electricity and cut off power coming from solar farms on sunny, low-demand days. Experts say, he continues, the deployment of industrial wind energy in the United States is likely to stall when the key wind energy subsidy, known as the Production Tax Credit, or the PTC, expires on December 31st. Renewables advocates say that the cost will eventually come down, subsidies will be renewed, and state mandates will kick in enough to save the industrial and wind and solar industries, but those efforts are unlikely to be successful enough, he says, politically to make much difference to the economics of renewables. He continues, in Ohio, lawmakers recently scaled back renewable energy mandates due to their high cost, choosing instead to subsidize nuclear plants. And around the world, renewables are making electricity more expensive despite years of promises by advocates that prices would come down. Germany again, he cites Australia, where the increasing regularity with which the wholesale power prices are sinking below $0 during sunny and windy days is becoming more than cancelled out by frequent high prices, defying expectations of a softening in levels overall, noted the Australian Financial Review. Even advocates are having to acknowledge that economics is a thing, and science is too. The University of Chicago, Schellenberger continues, found earlier this year that renewable energy mandates significantly increase average retail electricity prices. Thanks to the heavy deployment of renewables, electricity prices in California between 2011 and 2018 rose 7 times more, 28%, than they did in the rest of the country, which is 5%, while electricity prices have risen 50% in Germany since 2006. And today, Germany spends twice as much for electricity that produces 10 times more carbon emissions than France. Just 14% of Germany's energy and 35% of its electricity in 2018 came from renewables, and Germany's carbon emissions haven't declined significantly since 2009. So there are limits to wind, there are limits to government mandates, there are limits to the amount you can do with this, and the effect worldwide wherever it's tried is to raise energy prices, not cut them, and in many cases to force reliance on dirtier forms of energy rather than cleaner ones. Schellenberger continues that some renewables advocates claim hopefully the construction of transmission lines will make wind energy more viable in windy states like Kansas and Nebraska, but environmental opposition in those places is growing. Nebraska, local residents and conservationists filed a lawsuit to block the local utility from building a transmission line that will cut through 95% of the migratory flyway for the endangered whooping crane. Because, again, Trump's right, they're bad for birds. Despite much fanfare, the whooping crane has struggled mightily to recover from extinction, and the main cause of whooping crane death from humans is, in fact, transmission lines for wind power. Again, more endangered bird species is reported in Australia. It goes on. The wind industry has long denied it has such an impact. Points out that house cats kill more birds than wind turbines, but they don't. Especially, they don't kill the large endangered species. You don't see many house cats taking down albatrosses, as far as I'm aware, or cormorants. So, no, it's an attempted distraction. It doesn't work. Wind power is bad. Schellenberger separately has his Substack is well worth watching for anybody interested in the reality of environmental policy. In this case, that renewables are bad for the environment. They require 300 to 400 times more land than natural gas and nuclear plants, for one thing. As he says, they can't save the planet. It just isn't possible. They're not designed to do it. Their capacity cannot allow for it. They're environmentally destructive. As he says, now researchers at Princeton University and Bloomberg have admitted that the wind farms require 370 times more land than nuclear plants. The shifting away from nuclear and toward renewables, as Biden's climate plan does, or would do, would have a devastating impact on America's natural environment. A 200 megawatt wind farm, notes Bloomberg, might require spreading turbines over 19 square miles, or 49 square kilometres. A natural gas power plant with that same generating capacity could fit into a single city block. Schellenberger continues, everyone agrees we can increase to some extent the amount of electricity from solar panels and wind turbines. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory, whose mission is to promote renewables, claims 74% of California's electricity could come from solar panels. Princeton estimates that 11% of electricity could come from offshore wind projects by 2050. But, Schellenberg continues, after generating just 23% of its electricity from solar panels, California is suffering from blackouts and price spikes stemming from overdependence on weather-dependent energies. And imagine then what tripling solar production would do. It's also unlikely that the US would add anything like that amount of offshore wind. Today there are a total of just 7 offshore wind turbines. Generating 11% of our electricity from them would require building 20,000, and that's unlikely to happen, Schellenberger writes, given widespread opposition from conservationists, fisherfolk, and local residents. So, impractical as well as expensive and environmentally damaging. There's also a very good study, this is not the piece you'll see on screen at the moment, but there is a study showing that the estimates of environmental damage caused by discarded solar panels have been off by a factor of hundreds of percent. And they're so toxic, we're not actually allowed to put them on landfills in the United States and the United Kingdom, so we tend to export them to Africa instead, where no such environmental regulations apply, and then they end up poisoning children. And solar panels expire quite often. I think the average is probably about 12 years. So the more you build, the more waste you create. And the more poor slave children have to mine the minerals to create them as well. Same thing with batteries for electric cars, for instance, the cobalt and the lithium required for those. Just a bad idea. Bad idea indeed. This is from Fortune. Fortune, sorry. Just as Europe needs energy the most, the wind in the North Sea has stopped blowing, forcing regional energy markets to scramble for gas reserves to heat homes and power businesses, which has had very expensive consequences. As Fortune reports, as the European energy market grows increasingly reliant on a renewable energy source that is cheap to harness and carbon emission free, but is clearly unreliable when the wind isn't blowing, surging electricity bills are an unintended consequence of the energy transition. This happens everywhere. If the same policy in the United States produces the same results as the same policy in Europe and the United Kingdom, the fault is with the policy. It's not an aberration, it's not a freak, it's not a mistake. It's a consequence of the policy. And we need to start admitting this. Because there is a really good, cheap, cost-effective, carbon-free way of solving this problem, which is nuclear. But instead of that, we continue to pump tens of billions of pounds every year into building wind farms and solar panel arrays, into subsidies for their construction. And the price is ultimately borne by the consumer. It is always borne by the consumer, which is why energy prices across the West, everywhere these policies being implemented, are rising. As the Fortune continues, the situation is especially acute in the United Kingdom, where wind is currently only providing 7% of the country's total energy makeup, which is a steep drop from the 25% it generated on average across 2020. That's reliable, isn't it? You want cheap, renewable, and reliable energy? You've had it drop from 25% to 7%. That's not reliable. The Fortune article continues, the UK's offshore wind sector has been a success story of the energy transition, drastically cutting emissions, allegedly, by rolling out 24 gigawatts of wind power over the past decade, enough to power 7.2 million homes. But as wind slowed and the price of carbon credits rose to record highs, the electricity market has experienced extreme volatility. Even coal, it continues, the most carbon-emitting energy source, has returned to the stage. It now accounts for 3% of British energy makeup after a record-breaking 2 coal-free months. 2 months. Faced with the power crunch last week, the electricity market operator National Grid asked EDF to restart the West Burton, a coal power station in Nottinghamshire, but with a looming deadline to close all coal plants in the UK by 2024, this may not be an option in the future. Meanwhile, China is building hundreds of coal-fired power stations every year, tens, dozens a week. Us shutting down one or reopening one will make no difference at all, except to the lives of ordinary working people in the United Kingdom who will have to pay for the higher energy prices as a result of the energy policies pursued by Boris Johnson's government. We should all take a leaf out of Donald Trump's book. All of us should. Because Donald Trump is objectively right. And I am obliged to say, right again.